Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for this third session of the Great Rethink. I'm James P. Barbieri. I'm the Associate Program Director of the Pari Center, and I'll be your host for today. Today with me, we also have Eleanor Peat, the Program Director of the Pari Center, and David Lorimer, the Director of the Scientific and Medical Network, who will assist me and you during this phone call. Before I begin, I'd just like to remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this session. First of all, during the presentation, we ask participants to turn off the microphone just to ensure better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we hear any background noise. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion later during the Q&A, you can use the raise your hand function, and I'll call you out, and then you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, if you're shy, you don't want to ask a question yourself, you can just write it in the chat. And also we encourage everyone to turn on their cameras, as we believe seeing everyone's faces, everyone's reactions creates a nice educational environment. But if you don't feel comfortable doing so, feel free to just keep it off. And finally, all sessions are recorded. The recordings don't include the breakout rooms, but it does include the presentation and discussion. And the recordings will be available to you later this week. Enough about the rules. Let me introduce our speakers for today. Today we welcome Colin Tudge, biologist and writer, who founded the Oxford Real Farming Conference, a center and movement, if you may, dedicated to disseminate and explore ideas in agroecology and other ideas included in his latest publication, The Great Rethink. And as a special guest for this session, we welcome Ian Rappel, a geographer and ecologist working in conservation of NGOs. He is currently working on the development of the College for Real Farming and Food Culture, and also works as a Wales development manager for the National Association of AONBs. Today, Colin will have his presentation followed by a discussion with Ian. After that, we'll have breakout rooms, a short break, and then we'll move on to Q&A. In this session, Colin will focus on infrastructure by looking at the different forms and actions of governments needed for his great rethink. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Colin. Welcome.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for tuning in. Could we have slide number, we've got 3.0.
Yeah, just doing that.
Well, that's today. That's just to announce that why we're here. Well, you knew that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. There's Ian at the bottom. And could we have now 1.2, please?
Okay, I'll need to maybe go out of that. I'll just stop the share, and then I will restart when I've got to the right place, because I have to change my window.
Thanks. This is the diagram I show every week, every time. And the point is, as I'll just run over it quickly, the first thing is to define what our goal in life should be, which I suggest should be to create convivial societies with personal fulfilment in a flourishing biosphere. That's what all humanity should be aimed at. Last week, we discussed that. We also discussed action, what you actually need to do physically in order to create convivial societies in a flourishing biosphere. This week, today, this morning, we're going to discuss the infrastructure that's necessary to achieve that. And then this afternoon, we'll discuss mindset, the mindset that's needed to make everything happen. But this morning, we're focusing on the infrastructure. And the point is, and there are three bits of it, we need democratic government, we need this thing I'm calling economic democracy, and we need appropriate laws. It's those three things: government, democracy, and the law. And unless you get those three things right, you cannot create the conditions in which it's possible to have appropriate agriculture and appropriate technologies in general. And at the moment, what we've got is hopelessly wide of the mark and is causing us to create technologies that are not appropriate in order to achieve a flourishing biosphere, etc. And in particular, forms of agriculture that are absolutely antipathetic to what we should really be trying to do. Could I have slide number 3.1, please, David?
3.1, okay.
It's on its way.
I know it is on its way, but it just takes, there's a delay for the,
I can't do technology myself, so I'm, anyway.
3.1, share screen.
Be with you in a minute. Oh, well, I'll pretend it's up there and then we'll fix it.
It is up there.
It's up there, is it?
Yeah.
Oh,
The poster, the first slide is up at the moment.
3.1 is up.
No, that's 3.0.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Right. Great. Are we going to have the whole thing?
Is that it?
That's the whole thing. That's the whole.
Good.
Here we are. We're talking about the infrastructure, the third tier down of the diagram. First thing, the governance. I'm suggesting, and the governance effectively means the government, and it means it involves all politics, etc., etc. Now, I want to suggest that the point of government is to enable good things to happen, enable us to create the kind of technologies, etc., that we need to create a flourishing biosphere and conserve conviviality and so on. And that's precisely what we don't have at the moment. I suggested last week that in practice, the government most countries are governed by people who are, in effect, one could call them either gangsters or idiots, frankly. I mean, the way that the governments have ignored the threat of climate change don't even take account really of the fact that the living world, the biosphere, actually matters, is, in my opinion, not only criminal, but is actually a sin. And yet very few governments really take these things seriously. And only now are they beginning to respond. And that is dreadful. So we have to analyze not only what has gone seriously wrong, but what we need to do to put things right. The economy is seen as a game of money. That's how it's seen, that's how it's played out. And in a sense, that's what it is. But it's much more than that, because in practice, the economy, as I like to say, is the matrix of our lives. It is the medium by which we aspire to, or we try to translate our aspirations into action. If we don't get the right economy, then all our aspirations, however fancy, will go awry, which is what's happening at the moment. There are some huge mistakes attached to the economy, which have been identified in a whole string of books, some of which I've actually read. One of them is the idea that the economy or economics is or can be a science. And it simply can't. It doesn't deal, as science must, with hypotheses that can be properly tested. It all actually deals with sort of top of the head ideas by perceived authorities. And Joan Robinson, who was a very fine Cambridge economist, I like to say that there aren't many women economists who are famous, but they're like Scandinavian scientists. There are not many of them, but those that are made a considerable difference. And Joan Robinson said about this, all along, economics has been striving to escape from sentiment and to win for itself the status of a science. But lacking the experimental method, economists are not strictly enough compelled to reduce metaphysical concepts to falsifiable terms and cannot compel each other to agree as to what has been fortified. So economics links along with one foot in untested hypotheses and the other in untestable slogans. I think that summarizes it. And yet it's taken very, very seriously as if it was, well, absolute truth, or as if it was the gospel, and so on and so on and so on. In particular, at the moment, of course, the world is effectively in thrall to the particular branch of capitalism known as neoliberalism. Now, I, in contrast to a lot of people, including some good friends, including possibly Ian, have no outstanding objection to capitalism per se. It does seem to me, as Kenneth Clark was wont to say, or is wont to say, capitalism can have a human face, it can have a conscience. And the great founder of capitalism, Adam Smith, was himself a moralist, a moral philosopher before he was an economist. And so too was his successor, who was also seen as one of the great founders of modern capitalism, David Ricardo, early 19th century. They both took it as be self-evident, although they stated very clearly that the whole purpose that the economy must be contained within a moral framework. It should never be allowed to escape from that, otherwise we're all in trouble. And I would say, of course, it must never be allowed to escape not only from the moral framework, but from its ecological framework. It should almost work within the bounds of what is ecologically desirable and what is ecologically possible. The early 19th century, late 18th century guys didn't think so much in those terms because, as it were, the biosphere looked pretty safe. So they didn't think that they had to think about it too carefully. But nowadays, of course, we must. But neoliberalism is founded on the idea that you don't really need to be bound by external moral rules. The neoliberalism is geared to the idea that we should maximize wealth by competing in a meta-Darwinian fashion within the global market. Nothing else counts. And it's as if the economy itself becomes, or the global market itself becomes the moral arbiter. And whatever people will pay for is considered to be good, and what they won't pay for is ipso facto bad and is left on the shelf. I would say that the world is in a tremendous mess right now and is getting worse, largely because this neoliberal mentality prevails. Boris Johnson was on the television, British television, last night, saying, welcoming the new moves that are brought all over the world to try and contain climate change. But he was careful to emphasize, for the benefit of his neoliberal chums, or because he is a dyed-in-the-wool neoliberal himself, he actually said, we want to take care of what he would call the environment, not because we are bunny huggers, but because that's the way to create, in the long term, you need to encourage the economy and to create jobs. And this is the general mentality that looking after the natural world, and therefore looking after ourselves, is somehow something for children, bunny huggers, whereas making lots of money is obviously serious and what we should be focused on. Nowadays, of course, people like Boris Johnson, like Donald Trump, don't talk about making lots of money. They talk about creating jobs, which sounds much more sort of people-friendly. And the idea is that you can't create jobs except by the means that make lots and lots of money. To some extent, that's true, because if you can set up a profitable factory, you can employ lots of people, provided you don't, the fact that you might wreck the biosphere along the way is sort of too bad. But in theory, set up businesses that actually make money, and you can employ people. The irony is, however, that in order to maximize your wealth in the modern economy, so long as oil is affordable, you actually want to find ways of reducing labor. And the modern agriculture, which is geared to the maximization of wealth, seeks to employ as few people as possible. Traditional agriculture is the biggest employer by far of all jobs in the world. And already, I'm thinking the world as a whole, certainly in what's called the third world, I call it the third world as a whole, it employs more than half of all the people. But in a country like ours, economically so successful, etc., that employs only 1% of the people. So the idea that we should be maximizing wealth is in itself very, very suspect. But the idea that maximizing wealth is necessary to create jobs is, well, it can be entirely untrue. It can be the precise opposite of the truth. One other thing about economics being a science, it looks like a science because if you open an economic textbook, it's full of mathematical formulae and mathematical alleged proofs. And so are scientific science textbooks. So superficially, the festoons of maths look the same in the economy and in science. But again, you haven't got the testable hypothesis. Underneath it, you've just got ideas that you can translate into mathematical symbols. And as Joan Robinson said, I'm a fan of Joan Robinson. I don't think she's with us anymore, but she was active in the 1960s. Joan Robinson said, "I never learned mathematics, so I had to think." I'd like that slogan to be put up in all economics departments. I'll just see if there's anything else I need to say about this. No, let's press on. The law, the last thing, obviously we need laws that basically are on the side of the people, that dispense justice and so on and so on. And of course, a great many laws that we have do just that. And a great many lawyers are very serious moralists, and they fight hard for justice and so on and so on. Particularly as I know, I've come across several environmental journalists, economists of whom that's certainly true. Bobby Kennedy would be an example. But the law in many ways is actually anti-justice and anti-people. And in particular, the laws of property and the laws of land, which now make it very, very difficult, for example, for people to get back onto the land and to start farming properly, and which protect the big corporates that are messing the world up. Largely because, in fact, the big corporates can afford the services of lawyers, and as it were, ordinary people can't. Could I have the next slide, please, David? 3.2.
Sorry, this is what happens is I lose my cursor, and therefore I can't see to advance it. So just carry on, and I'll advance it as soon as I can, because this is the problem with Zoom. You lose your cursor, and none of the.
I'll just introduce it before is it coming?
It'll come as soon as I can, but I'm sorry. This is a hazard of Zoom. You lose your cursor, and so you can't actually manipulate the slide. I've got it again. Right, here we go. And shall I keep going with that one?
Should we just? Yes, thanks a lot. Can we put the whole lot up?
That's what I'm doing. And that's it there.
Of course, that the idea is that you have somebody in charge who looks after you. But actually, one should ask the question, do governments really look after us? Are they, in fact, on our side? And I think the notion that really summarizes what the morality that should lie behind good governance was beautifully summarized, as so many things are, by Jesus. And whether Jesus was divine or not divine is a question that absorbs theologians like mad. But whether he was or whether he wasn't, he was unquestionably among the greatest of all moral philosophers. And I think one of the greatest of the political thinkers. He should be rated, if nothing else, as a very serious intellectual. And anyway, here is a quote from Jesus from St. Mark, chapter 10, 42, 44. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Now, I think that's absolutely brilliant, and it summarizes what people in charge, how they ought to regard the job. It strikes me that whenever we get a new prime minister or America gets a new president, they always swear before God, as it were, that they will serve the people selflessly. It doesn't always seem to turn out like that. Shall we leave it there? I mean, people in high office seem to think that it's their own sinecure and their own leg up to fame and fortune and all the rest of it. That is dreadful. People like Thomas Hobbes addressed this in the 17th century, you know. You've got to have people in charge, but you've got to make sure they're working for you. And we've never quite cracked that. The key to it actually is democracy, because as democracy in the sense that everybody takes part is not workable. Democracy in the sense that you appoint people who are genuinely good and genuinely on your side is what we think we've got, but very clearly we haven't. Now, when it comes to governance itself or to the political structure, you find there's a whole number of dichotomies. Well, basically, when you look at politics, it's nothing if not, as it were, argumentative. People spend thousands and thousands of years arguing the same old questions, literally thousands. But all the discussions, I think, boil down to three fundamental dichotomies, which have to do with the kind of way you conceive the world and how you want it to be. And the first dichotomy is whether we should take societies very seriously and let the individuals take care of themselves, or whether we should take the individuals very, very seriously. The extreme left wing, the left wing in general is concerned primarily with societies. The right wing puts all the emphasis on individuals. If you do either to the exclusion of the other, then I think you finish up with a fairly disastrous kind of society. For example, I think I quoted last week Bolsheviks saying in Dr. Zhivago saying the individual doesn't matter, only the society matters. But the society, of course, is made up of individuals, and if the individuals don't matter, then what price the society? On the other hand, if individuals have no sense of society, which is the sort of traditional right-wing view of things, then you get no society at all. And that's comment by Margaret Thatcher when she first came to power in the 1980s, when she said there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and there are only or families. This is an absolute recipe of a disaster. And I think many people would agree that in the last 40 years, the thing that's really gone missing from the world, particularly the Western world, obviously, is the sense of the loss of a sense of society and the focus on the individual wealth, individuals competing for wealth. The second great dichotomy is whether the governance as a whole should be ordered from the top down, or bottom up. Now, Hans Herren, who is president of the Millennium Institute in Washington, simply says, and of course he's quite right, that again, both are important. There are certain decisions that have to be made, as it were, from the top and involve everybody. And things like the conservation of birds, which depend on bird migration. You have to have a rule that covers the whole world. Otherwise, bird migration can't happen. I mean, the birds might be well off in Africa and have a disastrous time when they get to Europe, or vice versa. That's just a trivial example of what I'm talking about, except it's not trivial trivial in a sense. Bottom up is fine, except again, you can't involve everybody in every decision. So somehow or other, you have to find a compromise between top down and bottom up. There's a tendency of Democrats to think that top down is always bad, and that people who embrace the idea of the top down must be themselves sort of selfish and bad and all that. But if you, for example, people like Cicero and Plato were both advocated very firmly top-down government, but the reason they did it was because they were convinced that they, and people like them, patricians and intellectuals could run the world, the country, much better than people at large could do. Well, in those days, when most people were illiterate and entirely uneducated, that might have been true. Nowadays, when we're looking for universal education, universal literacy, that is much less true. And I'm fairly convinced myself that we should have much, much more faith in the people and take much more of our lead from what people at large actually want. In other words, we are now ready to make democracy work as they weren't 2,500 years ago. That's one of the great challenges. The third great dichotomy, as I see it, is whether you take an entirely human-centered view of the world, anthropocentric, or whether you also care about the natural world, which is to take a biocentric view or a Gaia-centric view. Again, both are important. It's absurd to suggest that we should ignore the needs of human beings. It's also true, incidentally, that the people who are entirely anthropocentric and who ignore the natural world and not at all biocentric tend not to be concerned about the whole of humanity. I mean, people like, I think, Boris Johnson, say, who, as far to my mind, doesn't really care much about the natural world at all, although he says he does. He doesn't actually care about all of humanity either. He seems to me to care only for the people who are like himself. As George W. Bush used to say, my kind of people. But anyway, we've got to be a bit anthropocentric, otherwise it's ridiculous, but not exclusively. Being biocentric means you take the natural world seriously. There's to some extent altruism in this, but to some extent it's obviously enlightened self-interest, because if we allow the natural world to collapse, then we collapse with it. Again, there are real shades of approach, and you're talking about the biocentric approach, biocentric attitude. For example, there's the idea that we should be stewards of the natural world. And there are people who say that the line in Genesis, which says that human beings have been given dominion over the natural world, over the beasts of the field, etc., is actually saying you should be good stewards. Well, stewardship it's a huge advance on simply being indifferent or simply exploiting the natural world. But I don't think stewardship is quite enough. What we really need to cultivate is the sense that we are actually part of nature. In other words, the idea of oneness, and to cultivate too the idea that nature is itself sacred, and that to destroy wild nature is not simply, or should not simply be seen as a crime, which people are working on, but should be seen as a sin. And the idea of destroying the natural world should not simply be unlawful, it should actually literally be unthinkable. This short diversion on St. Francis, it's commonly supposed that St. Francis was very much on the side of nature, that he was totally besotted by it, etc., and regarded animals and plants as his brothers and sisters. It's very difficult to find anywhere in St. Francis's writings where he actually says that, although other people say he did say that. But the real point, there's a very good book on this, which I can't remember the name of. Anyway, the real point is that St. Francis was, whatever else, he was a great man, of course, but he was essentially a medieval gentleman. And as a medieval gentleman, he believed in the principle of chivalry. He believed very firmly in the chain of being, you know, that God was at the top, then human beings, then the rest of nature. And he believed as a human being above the rest of nature that he should treat the rest of nature well for chivalric purposes. But he didn't actually have a sense of oneness with nature as a whole. But we need this. We need a sense of oneness as well as a sense that we should take care of ourselves. Incidentally, I think you can permutate these dichotomies any way you like. So you can have people who are very interested in society as a whole rather than individuals, who think that society as a whole should be steered from the bottom up. In other words, real democrats. But you also have people who are interested in society as a whole who think that it should be governed from the top, which I think would be Lenin's view, although Ian may have a different view from that. And there are people who are very much sort of bottom-up democrats who are very Gaia-centric, and others who completely ignore the natural world. My own view is that we must be very conscious of society, which is what I think a socialist ought to mean, that we should be very conscious of we should govern from the bottom up as far as is practically possible. In other words, we really have to make democracy work, and we should be as biocentric as is possible. So you finish up with what I call green economic democracy, which I will come to. Whereas there are other individuals who, of course, who believe entirely in the rights of the individual and who are very top ground and who are entirely anthropocentric, which includes a lot of people who are now, for example, in the British cabinet. Again, one says, no wonder the world is in a mess. Can we have the next one, please, David? 3.3. Here we are. Now, this is what I reckon we should be thinking about and trying to create a good economy. This first one, these are first of all the premises. The premise is something that's irreducible. You say, this is how I think it is, and okay, you could argue with it, but we can't really reduce it any further than this. And one of the fundamental principles is that nobody should have less than is needed to live with dignity and to achieve fulfilment. But the second one is, but no one should have so much that their wealth and power affects the well-being of others. We've lost sight, actually, of both of these, but we allow people, even in rich countries like ours, to live on much less than is needed to live with anything at all, certainly not with dignity. And we also encourage people to get as rich as possible and to have so much that their wealth and power does indeed affect the well-being of others. I mean, I hate all those foreign harbours you see, and indeed in Britain now, which are absolutely full of luxury yachts. Nobody else can get a look in. Nobody else is allowed because they're so wealthy that they can simply buy everybody else off the face of the planet. Now, I think I said last week, one of the first people that I know about who actually enunciated these two principles, nobody too poor, nobody too rich, was St. Gregory the Great in the early 7th century. These ideas are ancient, but they've seemed to be forgotten. That's the terrible thing. We must be aiming for a society where there is a much more equal distribution of wealth than there is at the moment. If you have extreme inequality, then you find some people are right at the bottom and do indeed live without dignity, etc. And then some people are so rich that their power does indeed affect the rest of us very adversely. You've got to stop the top and the bottom. But also, it's now well established as a psychological, social principle that inequality itself is very, very damaging. Even if the people at the bottom of the heap are rich enough to have a roof over their heads and rich enough to eat at least twice a day, they can feel very, very bad if other people are 100 times richer than they are. It just changes the way you look at life. And this is demonstrable. You can show that in an unequal society, everybody feels badly, not only the people at the bottom, but everybody, because the inequality is itself so socially and psychologically damaging. We must be aiming for greater equality. And finally, of course, we must take care of the biosphere, which at the moment isn't really done. Now, put all these things together and you get, as I say, green economic democracy. So if I could have the next slide, please, David. This is all about green economic democracy. And the last slide dealt with the underlying premises, 4 of them. This deals with the ingredients. And I reckon there are 6 fundamental basic ingredients. First of all, let me go for number 2, first of all, the tripartite mixed economy. There are some, the tripartite mixed economy. The traditional idea of the mixed economy is that you have some public ownership, which in practice means government ownership. And government here is defined, can be local government, as it doesn't have to be national government. But you have public ownership and you have private ownership. The tripartite mixed economy says, no, actually, you need three components. You need public ownership, government ownership, private ownership, and community ownership. And the one that's been neglected so far, I suggest, is community ownership. And that very possibly is or should be the most important of all. To go back to the first on the list, however, any kind of business or enterprise or farm or anything else, however it's managed and whatever it's for, it should be conceived as a social enterprise. In other words, the only businesses theoretically we ought to allow as a community to happen are those that contribute to the well-being of society as a whole. In other words, contribute to the idea of conviviality, or contribute to the well-being of the natural world. If enterprises of any kind don't contribute to the well-being of the natural world or humanity as a whole, then quite frankly, we ought to say that they shouldn't happen. They should be illegal, prevented. And yet, of course, at the moment, many of the enterprises, many of the most successful in economic terms, most profitable enterprises, are very antisocial in their effects. Bad for people, bad for the biosphere. But we need the three components. A third notion is, I said I wasn't anti-capitalist because I don't see why one, it can have a human face. And capitalism largely entails that people make their own decision to invest money in enterprises that they want to succeed. And I would suggest that the enterprises we ought to be investing in for our own decision are social enterprises. And so you have this idea of what's called ethical investment, but ethical investment tends to mean that you don't invest in things that you obviously think are nasty. So you say, yes, I'll put my money into a bank, but not if the bank to invest, but not if the bank spends its money on bombs or guns, armaments, or certainly not if it spends it on child pornography, for example. In other words, but positive investment then is a special form of ethical investment, which says you don't simply not invest in things you don't like, but you only invest in things that you really do like, which in my case, I hope everybody's case, would include things like small farms, which farm in agroecological ways. I'm not sure whether the little allotment shown on the right is a good example of yes, I think it's not bad, of a agroecological smallholding in that case. Anyway, positive investment, serious component. The last thing of Unit 4, Principle 4, is that of universal basic income, where everybody in a society receives enough money to live on, irrespective of whether they do any work or not, just enough to keep alive. Now, there are loads of people who object very strongly to this because they say, well, it encourages laziness, and if ever, nobody should get any money at all unless they actually pull their weight and all those kind of things. But whenever it's been tried, and it has been tried here and there, it turns out that when people do have a universal basic income, and they do have a basic income irrespective of whether they work, they don't actually sit around and do nothing. They generally find something useful that they want to do, and actually find genuinely useful things to do that they like doing much, much better than they would if they had to join some job center and find some sort of menial task on behalf of somebody else. And it's generally found that whenever UBI is introduced, the society as a whole does become more convivial, more friendly, less crime, and so on and so on. It really works. And again, the principle is that you have to believe in human nature, really. And you have to believe that people given a chance will do the right thing, and broadly speaking, that actually works. It is the case that, for example, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and later than that, very poor people who didn't have jobs were stuck in the workhouse. And the whole idea of the workhouse was that they should be as nasty as possible, so that people were discouraged from going into them, so that they were encouraged, allegedly, to try and get a job in the world at large. They didn't have to go into the workhouse. But it doesn't work. It merely creates a very unpleasant society, which in the end is very expensive. But UBI, based on belief in human nature, does work. Those 4 ingredients are what you need, I suggest, to make a decent society work. But we also need to take care of the natural world, the biosphere. And I suggest that in order to be bio-friendly or Gaia-friendly, the economy should have 2 further ingredients. And the first is that it should be minimalist, and the second is that it should be circular, the circular economy. Now, I reckon the idea of the minimalist economy, I've never heard anybody say it, and I've looked it up on Google and I can't find any reference to minimalist economies. So I think the idea of the minimalist economy might be new. I lay claim to it. The point is, though, that at the moment, economies of the kind that the British government favours, and the Americans and everybody else, are to do with growth. They are to do with the maximization of wealth, which requires the maximum amount of resources used to create wealth. And we have this dreadful concept, which is taken for granted and seen to be very sensible, of maximum sustainable yield. So that when people are fishing, for example, they say, how many fish can we get out of the sea before the populations collapse? Now, in fact, as Ian will know, to calculate maximum sustainable yield is astonishingly difficult, and actually you need far more data than you're ever likely to get. Very hard to judge how much you can get out of a natural ecosystem before it collapses. And the idea that you can determine this simply on grounds of profit, on the grounds, for example, that if a fish becomes too rare, then you don't go on fishing it because it's not economically viable. The idea that you can protect wild populations by that kind of principle is naive in the extreme. But I'm suggesting that instead of just improving the ecology so that we could judge what the maximum sustainable yield is, we should completely reverse the mindset and say not how much can we get out and how much money can we make, but the complete opposite. What is the absolute minimum that we need in materialist terms, either in money or in resource, to create convivial societies for ourselves, to achieve personal fulfilment for ourselves, and to look after the biosphere? And I think it's obvious that the amount that we actually need to make the world work well is about 1/10 of what they would now be using in California, and about half or a third of what we middle classes or even the average person is now using in Britain. And these are the terms we should be thinking about. This is what they should be thinking about as this new climate conference. What is the least we need to make the world work well? And the final thing, of course, is now a well-known principle of the circular economy. And the idea not simply that stuff is recycled, but whatever is manufactured should be manufactured in such a way that it's effectively modular, and all the parts, including the ones that some of the parts of a machine will last for 100 years and some will only last for 6 months. You should make it so that, well, as many pieces as possible work for 100 years, but also that you can take whatever a machine apart and reuse the parts that are still reusable, and only recycle the ones that are the bits that don't really work anymore. I know people that are working on this kind of approach, but it's circular economy very important. The last thing I don't have a slide for is to talk about the law, and in particular, what really matters more than anything else, I think, is the law of the land. Who owns the land? Who can use it for what purposes? And here we find this dichotomy between people who say we should do land sparing, and for example, we should divide the world clearly into bits that human beings use, like cities, and only wildlife can bear, which is what I might call wilderness or national park or something like that, and the bits that are used for production, notably for intensive agriculture. And the idea is that the more intensive and therefore allegedly the more productive the agriculture is, the more you liberate the land for wilderness. It never works like that. It simply doesn't. The mentality is wrong besides anything else. But what the principle that really does work is land sharing, where you say, look, actually what we should be trying to do is to use all bits of land in all circumstances in as mixed a way as possible. In other words, cities as well as farms should be wildlife friendly, and wilderness as far as possible should be accessible to human beings, and so on. And this is the great challenge, actually, to create ecosystems, including cities, that actually accommodate us human beings and also are good for the natural world. Finally, just to say, it is obvious to me, it's obvious to everybody, it's obvious that we are at the moment a million miles from creating the kind of infrastructure that would lead us towards convivial societies and flourishing biosphere. In fact, in many ways, we're going in totally the opposite direction. And all these international, conferences, which are necessary possibly and are happening, but they all begin with the wrong premises as far as I can see. They're not trying to ask, what do we really need to create conviviality, etc., etc. So we've got to have a real rethink. This is why we have a real rethink. And in fact, the rethink is such that it amounts to a renaissance. And here's my book again. It's called The Great Rethink, and it is subtitled A 21st Century Renaissance. And the 21st Century Renaissance involves a rethink of everything, a restructuring of most of it, and as far as can be managed, control by people at large. Firstly, because that is the just thing to do. And secondly, because I think the collective intelligence of human beings as a whole is far greater than the very specialist outlook and knowledge of most governments. That's it, basically. That's it for this section.
Thank you so much for that, Colin. It was fantastic presentation, a good critique of modern politics and economics, and also you've rebuilt from there. So thank you so much for that, Colin. I guess we can move to Ian. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I probably doubt it is because it's still good morning. So my name is Ian Rappel. I'm a socialist ecologist based in mid Wales in the Black Mountains. I've been working with Colin and Ruth and others on the Real Farming College and the development thereof for off and on about 3 years or so now, I think. My background is in ecology, but also I had a period of time as an academic working on third world development and issues like that. So none of you will be particularly surprised to know from that background that I am a radical. And that's one of the areas where there's certainly a great deal of overlap between Colin and myself and the work of the Real Farming Trust. And that's why it's such a pleasure to come and make a contribution to a session like this, because I have the comfort of knowing that most of the people who are appearing on a screen and normally in an audience, but are likely to be sympathetic to some degree with my views. It's one of the things about being a radical in capitalist society is you're quite often seen as a kind of freak, and it's quite nice to know that isn't the case in this instance. There are two main arguments I wanted to make in response to Colin's talk, but also in response broadly to his lovely book. And they're challenges in a way. They're not counter arguments to anything that Colin has put forward. I think there's a very strong argument for a rethink. I think there's a strong tradition of that goes back a few hundred years, but Colin is certainly one of the fine modern examples of that. But there are two key things. One is I am an anti-capitalist, and I think that's one area that I would like to explore in the next few minutes, which is that there's a continuity between capitalism and the way it's developed and its neoliberal expression. And neoliberalism hasn't dropped from space. It hasn't even dropped from the minds of Margaret Thatcher and General Pinochet and the Chicago School of Economists and that sort of stuff. It's a response of the capitalist system to a particular set of crises. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that I feel actually that anti-capitalism is relevant because of the continuity of the system. And the second thing I want to say is that actually what Colin is representing, a renaissance in the context of neoliberalism and its trajectory, is actually revolutionary. It isn't simply that we can change things by thinking differently. It is, at this stage in history, if we are to get to a historically viable mode of society through things like the Great Rethink, we actually do need a social revolution. And those are the two kind of key arguments that I want to make. And they're, if you like, additions to Colin's arguments rather than detractions from it. And that's quite important to stress from the outset. I've got some slides, so if David, if you could just ping it up, and I will use the phrase "next slide, please," because apparently that's quite fashionable. If you're happy with that. So I've called it "Infrastructure's Impediment," and with the subtitle of "Naming the Beast." And what I mean by that is I don't think we can go around capitalism. I think we need to see it for what it is. The slide you've got in front of you, if you can see it, is the lovely Lower Wye Valley, which is one of the areas of outstanding natural beauty that I help look after. In the background, you can probably just see Tintern Abbey, and in the foreground, you can see an old dilapidated railway bridge that was there when before beaching stripped out the system, so it supported steam engines at some point. And that's a deliberate choice, not just because it's a beautiful slide, but it's the artificiality or the man-made elements within that slide that I think are important. Plus the fact that those two elements of infrastructure that you can see there, Tintern Abbey, which was of course trashed by Henry VIII, and the steam engines that were, pushed off the scene by oil. Those are parts of previous infrastructures that to do with the way that the systems and social systems have developed through history. So it's a sneaky slide in a way, because it's meant to make you go, how beautiful, but at the same time I just wanted to add a little bit of nuance. So next slide, please, David. Colin's fantastic title to this section for infrastructure is "What's Gone Wrong with the Way We Run Things." And there are so many things to say on that it was spot for choice, really. What I wanted to do in the first instance is to draw it back to agriculture and why agriculture is so central. So the next couple of slides will look at that. There's a quote, a very nice quote from Keith Douglas Warner, which I can't actually see because I've got my, hang on a second. So it says, agricultural science is like the tip of the spear. It indicates the trajectory of progress, for better or for worse. And that's obviously because agriculture is one of the central elements within society. Without agriculture, we can't feed ourselves, and we don't have any means of social reproduction. So our societies would just collapse. And that's been the case at least for the last 12,000 years. And there would have been elements of that pattern even under hunter-gatherer society. So it's quite a nice way of looking at it. And next slide, please, Tim. So if we are thinking about why the world is so poorly run, we need to think about, well, whose infrastructure it actually is. Who does it belong to? Why are we subject to such an awful thing? And this lovely quote is from the graveside speech from Friedrich Engels at Marx's funeral, Karl Marx's funeral in March 1883. And he said this: so just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history, the simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. Therefore, the production of the immediate material means, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, form the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, arts, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved. So what is central there are two elements. One, again, is a reinforcement of the central role of agriculture, because agriculture is food, and food is the means by which we can become human. So once we've addressed our material needs, we can think about law, science, psychology, all of those lovely things. But if we don't have it, food, and we mess up agriculture, we just simply can't act as human beings. George Orwell said it slightly differently. He said the materialism for the working class starts with the stomach, not the heart. And what he was trying to say there is for a lot of people, you know, in poverty and working class, they don't get a chance to indulge in what we might think of the finer pursuits of society, because they're too busy trying to get food on the table for themselves and their kids and so on. So it's got that central material necessity, agriculture, and it's the reason why, above all else, we need an agricultural form that's sustainable, so that we can spread that ability to meet material needs right the way across humanity, for the convivial society that Colin has said we aspire to. The second part is about how do we understand the infrastructure? And as I said, it's not as if things like laws and forms of democracy and, you know, patterns of voting and all those sorts of things have dropped from space or anything like that, or even just being created in human beings' minds. They're all about the tension within society, and I would argue the tension between a minority who hold power and control and design those things, and the majority who are effectively subject to those pressures. And it's the constant tension between those two things that drive progress. And that's in effect what we're going through in this discussion. You know, we're a group of people who are dissatisfied with the, if you like, the status quo, the dominant ideology, the prevailing and hegemonic way in which powers has created the world, and we're pushing back against that. So that we're part of the engine of change in that respect. Next slide, please. So there's three areas that Colin looks at in the chapter. One is democratic government. Now, I think there's a very good quote from John Dewey, an American sociologist and educationalist from back in the 1930s, I think, that said that government is the shadow cast on society by big business. And I think it's a fantastic quote, because if you want any indications of that, it's a slide I've put in here that gives you an indication. Agribusiness and chemical corporations, and it shows you these enormous corporations that have taken over our food chain now, and all of the different things that they're linked with, all the different areas of research, and agriculture itself in that higher sort of corporate sense is now becoming an industry. It's no longer in any sense the agriculture that we present to our children, you know, of family farms and those sorts of things. It's becoming more and more a form of corporate business, and it's very clearly linked to corporate agendas and profit and those sorts of things. Farmers have shifted their position in respect to this. They would have had in the past a lot more control over the way in which they did things. But these days, you know, a lot of farmers have set contracts, tell them where to grow, when to grow it. and who to market it to, and decisions are made over whether or not harvest should be thrown away or retained based on the presumed tastes of consumers that people like supermarkets control. So there's the sense that there's any democratic government in the face of that corporate power, I think, is a challenge, because you think about how much time we spend exercising our democratic right. I would be very surprised, unless you're a member of a trade union where you get to vote a bit more often, if you spend more than about 3 or 4 hours in your lifetime voting. And that's the prevailing so-called democratic setup. It doesn't give you many options. It just allows you to choose every 4 years between parties that are increasingly the same because they're increasingly neoliberal. So that's the first thing to say. This is if we're going to talk about democratic government, we need to talk about, and we can't skirt around the fact that actually the shadow of corporate power over democratic norms is very dark and very deep, and we can't simply attenuate the shadow. We need to push back. Next slide, please. And then there's the concept of economic democracy, and what I wanted to say here is that I think the prevailing economic sort of ideas that are neoliberal at the moment, although they're playing fast and loose with it in the face of a global depression, has become the extreme center. So if you want to try and make an argument that we shouldn't privatize something, or that something should be brought back into public ownership or community ownership, as Colin was talking about, you're seen to be outside of the central point of consensus, and that is that it's the market that is the best mechanism by which society should decide anything. And if you want to see the most recent expression of that, if you look at the Das Gupta review on the value of biodiversity, it's all in there. It's basically saying that nobody values the environment because we haven't put a financial price on it, which of course is nonsensical. But I just thought I'd put a little indication of how normal this language has become and how kind of sinister it's become in a way. These are little graphics from the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund more or less controls the way in which every single country in the world decides to run its economy. And it does that because at some point, the IMF has bailed them out. Has bailed them out, and in the process of bailing them out, in other words, bailing out usually speculators who've created all sorts of financial bubbles, they pass on the costs of that bailing out to us as the public, and that's done through austerity, and it's done through privatization and other such things. IMF, as it's been applied, its policies in the third world in that respect, is a much more efficient form of imperialism for capitalism than even the old gunboats used to be, because now it stands above every single country in the global south. And you have to be a very courageous and revolutionary government to even contemplate not following the diktats. The most recent example of that we could give is that in India in 1992, I think it was, its national budget was sent to the IMF for approval prior to its discussion at cabinet level in the world's so-called largest democracy. And I think there's a straight line between the policies that the IMF have overseen in the global south in countries like India and the total chaos that we're seeing on the ground at the moment in terms of how countries are able to cope with a global pandemic. The health systems have been hammered by 30 years of privatization, and their ecology has been captured by global corporations. So these are big things that it's just the sense that we can't go around them, really. It's not that we're powerless in the face of them, but that we can't go around them just by ideational change. These are concrete material things in the world that must be addressed. Next slide, please. Just to reinforce the point about the IMF, and this is just a point of interest, it does have that hegemony, and it is more or less in control of how budgets are set across the world. But it's quite interesting that the voting mechanism within the IMF is exactly the opposite to democratic. It's $1, one vote, in effect. Now, contrast that with the United Nations, where it's one nation, one vote. And you can see immediately that democratic deficit that's occurring within the architecture of neoliberalism is very strong. You can see it by the behavior of the United States, actually. The United States is notoriously appalling at paying its fees and dues to the United Nations. It's always behind, it's probably still in debt as we speak. But it's never missed a payment to the IMF. And the reason it's never missed a payment to the IMF is that it must retain that 15% plus voting power within the IMF structure in order to control the entire structure and modus operandi of the IMF itself. And you can see it very clearly in that graph in front of you. 16.52% of the votes it gets based on this strange SDR process where it's the more money you put in, the higher your power. So we've got that central problem that economic democracy is a long way from where we are because of the way that neoliberalism and capitalism has developed. Next slide, please. So I put this lovely slide. I know this is Colin's quite a fan of Tony Benn, so it's fair enough. Tony Benn, I had great pleasure of meeting once. You know, he was somebody who observed progressive politics as well as participated. He was completely consistent in that respect. And the quote is good. It is the same each time with progress. First they ignore you, then they say you're mad, and then dangerous. And then there's a pause and you can't find anyone who disagrees with you. That's a wonderful way of looking at it. And I think if we're thinking about the work of the Real Farming Trust and agroecology and progressive farming and all of those agroecology and everything at the moment, where we are at the moment is where we're at the bit, I think where we're seen as a bit mad. And where we need to be is at the point where we pause and find there's no one around us who disagrees. And I know that if you speak to individual farmers, a lot of them are at that point, but they're still forced by material circumstances to farm in ways that are harmful and of no long-term benefit to society. So the key little bit is the bit in the middle, which is about being dangerous. And that's not dangerous in the sense of necessarily violent, but certainly threatening to the status quo. And that means transferring what we have into a coherent social movement that supports each other, that links up with other social movements and drives forward with progressive change. Next slide, please. Now, that leads me to the conclusion, as I said I was going to make, which is that Colin's ideas of Renaissance is actually revolutionary. And whatever we think of revolutions in the past, we can perhaps discuss that. I'm very happy to. But if you look at the trajectory where we are now, and you think about even what we've gone through in the year of the pandemic, you know, the barbarism of the system has grown, not shrunk. You know, you think of someone like Bolsonaro. You know, he took advantage of the pandemic to both ignore it, but also to set fire to the Pantanal and enhance the burning of the Brazil's rainforest. I mean, those are not people that we can negotiate with in an ordinary sense. They're not reasonable. They're interested in profit for themselves and their rich mates, and they must be confronted. So it's whether or not we're able to confront that through the traditional kind of post-war reformism, or whether we've got to the point now where neoliberalism is so locked in that really to think anything other than neoliberal thoughts and progressive thoughts is actually a revolutionary act in itself. And in which case, that idea of connecting movements becomes more and more important. I've just put it in boxes. So in terms of infrastructure, democratic government, capitalism and neoliberalism is so-called representative. As I said, you're lucky if you get an hour of voting in your life. It's limited. We have privatized media. We have corporate control of more or less everything, from sport right the way through to the food we eat on our plate. In contrast, the great rethink, or what I would describe as eco-socialism, is direct, it's intergenerational, and it's biospheric. So it's the very antitheses of the prevailing system. Economic democracy is the same thing. Market hegemony. We are told that you're only worth what you can either buy or sell on the market, including your old neighbor. your own labor, and vast inequalities. Apparently the world's billionaires have made 30 trillion in the last year, and oddly enough, the working people of the world have lost 30 trillion in the last year. So you can see what's going on very clearly. And then there's economic imperialism, and I gave the example of the IMF, but I could apply the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and any of the sort of regional development banks there. Aid conditionality as well. We always give money in terms of aid, but there's always conditions, and they're usually neoliberal ones. It needs hegemony. What I mean by that is we should replace the market with what human needs are. And again, I think it ties in with Colin's idea, but it is revolutionary. It's not something that we're going to be able to create unless we confront the power structures that are in front of us. And food, shelter, and culture for all, it's completely achievable. It's inexcusable that we don't have that. But there is a reason rather than an excuse, and the reason is the prevailing social form. Laws of the land, private power is completely dominating the laws that we have. It's based on individualism, including corporate individualism in the United States, where corporations have the rights of individuals within the legal system, which is why they're so hegemonic over there. It's short-termist and it's anthropocentric, and what we need is the opposite: equality, fairness, intergenerational laws, international laws, and something that takes into account the biosphere and the natural world. Next slide, please. I think what I'm trying to say in the bigger picture is that we've got two sort of anthropocenes available to us. The one is a capitalist dead end, and that's a very serious proposition, which is that another century of this sort of behavior of capitalism will at the very least undercut our own material requirements as societies, but certainly will destroy an awful lot of species on the planet. And capitalism and the elite who are involved in it all are operating in a very similar way to the asteroid that hit the planet and killed off the dinosaurs. We're going through a 6th mass extinction, and it's being done for profit. It's not being done for any other human need or some inherent human characteristic. It's being done for profit. The alternative is what I touched to Colin's book and other ideas, which is a convivial, open-ended epoch, an Anthropocene that we could be proud of, that I'm sure under a democratic system we would even rename to make it more biocentric and more useful. And the reason why I think it's important and significant to think about capitalism in that context is that if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, this is from a PNAS paper that just came out this month, actually. It's a fantastic bit of work that shows that human beings have dominated the terrestrial ecosystems for the last 10,000 years. There's no doubt about it at all. Ever since agriculture came to be developed, nearly every part of the world its ecology has been embedded with human society. It is not the case that we deal now with any meaningful concepts of pristine wilderness or natural state or those sorts of things. Human beings, when Captain Cook sailed the world, he found humans everywhere. The only place he couldn't find humans were on a couple of small islands in the South Atlantic. And his shipboard artist was so freaked out, he had to paint penguins on the beach to show penguins greeting the sailors instead of people. It's the fact that capitalism arrives, and here you can see it very clearly in that graph. It arrives from the 15th and 16th century onwards. It accelerates in terms of its spread and its violent recalibration of ecology around the world to the point where we are today. And although this chart has got population growth on it, I would say that's co-symptomatic rather than causal. But that's only my argument. Next slide, please. And this is the last one. And it's to set off the contrast and what I think are the clear lessons from Colin's work and other things. The first point is to say, and this is Chomsky, and I'm very happy to quote him. He's a brilliant man and politically consistent, even if I don't agree with some of his stuff. He said, I don't know what word in the English language, I can't find one, applies to people who are willing to sacrifice the literal existence of organized human life so they can put a few more dollars into highly stuffed pockets. the word evil doesn't even begin to approach it. And those are fundamentally the people that we're dealing with. You know, the top 3 billionaires now have more wealth than the bottom half of the human population of the planet. And that's just a material fact that we are going to have to confront. And then in terms of the confrontation, the other lesson that I think Chomsky usefully outlines is this, and this is where it's relevant to the discussions and the movement that we're now part of. There are no magic answers, no miraculous methods to overcome the problems we face, just the familiar ones. Honest search for understanding, education, organization, action that raises the cost of state violence for its perpetrators, or that lays the basis for institutional change, and the kind of commitment that will persist despite the temptations of disillusionment, despite many failures and only limited successes, inspired by the hope of a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that. You've managed to successfully expose even more problems in our economic system, but at the same time managed to propose some solutions. So thank you so much for that, Ian. So we have run a little bit over today, so I would maybe propose we skip the 5-minute break, maybe go straight into the breakout rooms and then for 10 minutes, and then we can come back and start Q&A right away. If everyone's happy with that, Colin and Ian?
Sure.
Okay, great. So so we'll go into breakout rooms now for about 10 minutes. So we should come back around 12:30. So you should get the invitations very shortly. And see you in 10 minutes. Hope everyone's had a interesting discussion in your breakaway rooms. I guess we can start moving on to Q&A, where you have the opportunity to ask questions to Colin, Ian, and even David Lorimer, who's here with us. I think Colin had just left just because I held him up in the breakaway rooms talking, and he wanted to take a little break, but he should be back soon. There he is. Hi, Colin. To ask a question, if you could use the raise your hand function, that would be great. The raise your hand function can be found in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. If you've got a question, raise your hand. Diane.
Yes, Colin. You were saying about there's not many women economists. That is very true. There's not many women anything in the old way, but it's growing. There's more people. But I would ask, do you know about Kate Raworth and donut economics? Does that fit in with your plan or your ideas?
Ideas and mine are very, very, very close. I mean, in the first talk, I said everything we do in life, including very obviously the economy, must be guided by what I would call the bedrock principles of morality on the one hand, of which the main one is compassion, actually caring about, etc., and must be rooted in ecological reality on the other hand, and that therefore these two things of morality based on compassion and ecology based on knowledge, as far as we've got it, of how the world works, must be the guide for everything, and must be the guide for the economy, which is the means by which we do things. And the neoliberal economy basically ignores both. It's morality. What it basically says is that what the market decides is good. What people will pay for is good. I think it doesn't even exclude child pornography unless you specifically write it in. And it ignores the natural world altogether. You know, it's just a resource. And sorry? So yes.
Kate Raworth is good and you could work together. We could unify.
We've never been directly in touch. I've been in her company, but we should. Yes, I agree with you. I'd like to get her on board, as they say.
Lovely. Thank you. That'll do.
Thank you, Diane. David and Ian, did you want to build on that?
Just just to say that as you probably know, Amsterdam has adopted donut economics. So that's a very significant large city that is committed to working this one through. And I think one of the things that strikes me about that is the value of a good metaphor. And so the Gaia is a very good metaphor, very powerful metaphor. And I think the donut is equally powerful in that sense, because everybody, once they've seen the diagram, they can understand what it means. And we think visually. So maybe we ought to be thinking also whether the other metaphors that Colin and Ian and we here could develop, which would be appealing.
You don't think enlightened agriculture has sufficient resonance? It's all right, that's a rhetorical question.
No, I think it's a very good phrase, but it's not an image.
Yeah. This is my image, but it's
yes. No, this is that's work in progress, I think.
Okay, good thought.
It needs a name that sells, like a nice image. Yeah. So, and Ian, did you want to say something as well?
Well, if people don't know about it, there's in Wales we have a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and it's an act that was passed by the Senedd, the Welsh Assembly here, and it requires that all public bodies basically test anything that they want to introduce or fund against sustainable development ideas based on Brundtland report from the late 80s. So it's a very important piece of legislation, and things like the donut economics actually are coming in now into Wales off the back of that, because by setting this up, Welsh government has effectively forced itself to look at lots of progressive economic ideas. So in my main part of my work in life, where I work for the designated protected landscapes, we've been asked to consider the function of landscape in green recovery from COVID based on ideas of circular economy and donut economics and those sorts of things. So it does show that sometimes if you can tweak the legislative environment, you can open the door to progressive ideas this way. But it's still a fight to stop stupid things like motorways being built up. It doesn't stop you from having to struggle on a daily basis for sanity, but it does help.
HS2, I mean, that's another complete piece of madness.
Can I just return very briefly to the whole idea of Kate Raworth and simple symbols and all that kind of slogans. This diagram on the front of my book is actually quite complicated. One problem, though, that actually the business of Renaissance is intrinsically complicated. You can't really summarize it in one phrase or therefore in one picture. And I like Einstein's little adage that ideas should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I don't want to oversimplify, is my point. We've got to reconcile the need for complexity with the need for instant appeal.
Yes, good point, Colin. Good point.
Sorry?
Yes, I guess we can take another question. Again, you can use the raise your hand function, or if you're feeling a bit shy, you can write your question in the chat section and I can read it out for you.
While we're waiting for that, I'll just give you an example of something local that happens here. I discovered there was an old comb factory, a horn comb factory. Well, I say factory, I'd say workshop, would be a better way of describing it. And all the equipment is over 100 years old. But the problem this man has in passing it on is it doesn't meet current health and safety standards. And therefore the whole thing would have to be abolished in order for him to continue the business. That sort of sums up the sort of paradox that we've something that has been sustainable for 100 years, and the machinery still works, still makes lots of handmade combs. The current legislation means that you have to shut it down and then start again, which is just a kind of reductio ad absurdum.
Incidentally, James, there's a question here by Lloyd Hanson on the chat box, which I think is rather good. I'd like to address it. Is Lloyd Hanson here?
He is, or at least he should be. Lloyd, you want to come in?
Sorry?
Hello. Yes, Colin, I'm here.
I wondered if you'd just like to enunciate your question and expand upon it.
Now, which question in particular are you looking at?
How do we learn to love one another?
Yes, that to me seems to be the critical challenge. I was really captured by Joseph Needleman's book, Why Can't We Be Good? And our religions have been religions of fiat. Do this, do that. And that isn't the way that we human beings learned to relate to one another. And so how do we learn the practice of truly loving one another and loving the entire circle of life?
I do myself. I mean, obviously everybody here believes in this thing called education. People are not, it seems to me, in many cases, educating or teaching the right things. I mean, the school that I went to, when I went to it in the 1950s, it was a what's called a public school, and the whole idea was that you achieve excellence in various fields, which many people did. But the whole idea was that you achieved excellence in order to help other people. I mean, it was excellence in the cause of service, which actually was we'll leave it at that. But the same school in the 1980s, which is when I sent my son to the school, rather foolishly, I think, the ethos had changed completely, and it was now neoliberal. And the idea was that you achieved excellence in order to become rich and dominant and do your thing. Well, it's the school itself. I mean, the schools themselves should be teaching conviviality, which is the outcome of what Christians call love. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, I think, is that we're taught, or we're brought to believe, that human beings are basically selfish and basically competitive, and that we all are naturally trying to be out for ourselves. And this is the line that Thomas Hobbes took, that life would be brutish and short were it not for a government to keep us all in order. And Cicero said the same kind of thing. And that's nowadays considered to be, or Darwinian. We're bound to compete because that's the way natural selection works. But actually, there's a totally different way of looking at things that, as I discuss in the book, that nature is more cooperative than it is competitive, and that human beings, when you boil them down, are more cooperative than they are competitive. And we achieve a great deal when we cooperate. And human beings are, along with a lot of other animals, are intrinsically compassionate, and that the real point is to create societies, to create an ethos in which the innate cooperativeness and compassion of people at large can come to the fore. And the society as such, the neoliberal materialist, ultra-competitive economy is such that people that are foolish enough to spend their time being compassionate and convivial and all the rest of it go to the bottom of the heap. And that's all. The main thing is to allow the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put the matter, to flourish, to come to the fore.
I think another issue that I had suggested or touched on in one of my comments is that because of the acceptance of these views of who we are as human beings, and because of their willingness to do absolutely anything to achieve their ends. From the beginning of civilization, it has been primarily psychopaths and sociopaths who have been the great leaders, and that's of nations and of corporations. And until we, the people, are willing to stand up and say no to the psychopaths and sociopaths, there isn't much of a path ahead for us.
I agree entirely. I mean, as I say, though, the good thing is that most people would agree with what you're saying, if only, as it were, they would get their act together.
Thank you. Just in response to that, we've actually got 2 sessions next week which address this. One is with Rabbi Dozik, Wayne Dozik, and this is his new book called Radical Loving. And so I'm doing a book briefing on this on Thursday. The one last week, when it was meant to happen, fell foul of internet problems. And then we've also got the Call to Unite on Saturday next week with Tim Shriver, and he's the editor of one of these books, and he's the chairman of the Special Olympics and is the nephew of John F. Kennedy. So we're working on it.
Good. Can I just ask, do you think that the publication of books like this, and there's quite a few in part-time, does actually represent a real change, or is it just a sort of blip? I mean, is the Renaissance happening? Is my question.
I think there is a groundswell, and I mean, I meant also to recommend and mention Revolutionary Love by Rabbi Michael Lerner, which came out last year. So I think that what I feel is important is to develop a coherent discourse of love as a power and a principle, not just as a sentiment, which is what, and this is, I think your book is a part of that.
Can I ask Ian what he thinks about that? Do you think there's a real change happening?
I mean, yes, in many respects, but I don't think it's. I think sometimes we see progressive action and change, and sometimes we don't see it, but it's still there. And I think it's a bit like a river running through limestone. You know, sometimes it's on the surface and sometimes it's beneath. And I think the objective circumstances at the moment, so you know, the sheer horror of coronavirus and how that's hit poor countries in particular, but everybody in effect, combined with the obvious corruption that we're seeing with Western governments, probably means that there's a heightened awareness and a heightened critique within society about of what's going on. Our problem is that we have very limited choices at the ballot box. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in the Labour Party at the moment, they're moving rapidly to the right and kicking out any left-wingers. We're being forced into the position again of what Tony Benn described in the past as a sort of 3-party, 1-party state. And that means, you know, there's no way of expressing people's critique or radicalization or abject horror with what's going on at the ballot box. And it probably means that John Dewey's point, the American sociologist's point about democracy, is even more important. He said, don't focus on the ballot box, focus on the debates, focus on creating the debates within society that will, you know, create change either during a government's time in power through public pressure or through the ballot box or in revolutionary means. But don't get hung up on or depressed by the fact that people are still going to vote Tory in the next election, irrespective of them killing 130,000 people now and 130,000 people under austerity in the previous regimes. You know, it's very important that we maintain dialogue and discourse, and that's the engine of democracy and democratic response. And your book is part of that picture, I think. And I've seen it, you know, looking at the other lists of talks, you can see that people are coming from all different angles, whether it's spirituality or materialism, it doesn't matter, to critique and ask questions about the system that's prevailing. And that's the only way we're going to make change. But I still don't think we're going to do it unless we actually confront power at some point.
Very interesting. Unfortunately, we should move on just because we've got many hands up and not a lot of time. But this was really interesting discussion here. I think the first person with their hand up was Deborah.
Hi. So I'll be quick. And Colin, just so you know, in the past week, I've used your talk about a renaissance and called it a COVID renaissance. So I think you are giving us language, and it's finding these simple little messages to share with people, and you have no idea where the seeds get planted. But last week I was hopeful, and this morning I was not so hopeful, but I realized it's because it's a much bigger issue, and it's the democracy. But I wondered if the baby steps, that's what I felt we got last week, is more around this concept of stakeholder capitalism, where everybody has to be, it's a win-win for all instead of simply the investors. And if that's something we could really bridge easily for people to say, you know what, I can get my head around that. And how do I make sure the organizations I invest in or that I work with or that I buy products from, make sure that there's a win for everybody, the employees, suppliers, customers, the investors in the community, the big issue being the community. So I just wondered if you thought about that.
Sorry, one trouble for me is that combination of the sound and my own hearing, I didn't really hear what you were saying. I'm sure it sounded very good. But anybody, David, is there something you could summarize? Sorry, but I can hear his voice for some reason.
Well, she was saying that she's not so hopeful now. I was actually, sorry, I wasn't listening completely myself because I was typing something into the chat box. So could you just put your question again, Deborah?
Yeah, and it's probably my bandwidth. I live in the country, and I'm in Canada. So it's more the concept of stakeholder capitalism. And is that something we could focus our energies on? And stakeholder capitalism is making sure everybody in the system, the ecosystem in the whole, is actually represented in the focus of the organization.
Thank you.
Somebody else will have to.
Stakeholder capitalism. What's your view on stakeholder capitalism?
Yeah.
It's also advocated by the World Economic Forum.
I want to sort of reverse what Ian said. He said, you can have all these sort of great moral, spiritual ideas, as I understood you, great moral, spiritual ideas, but you have to focus on the structure in order to make proper change, the way the world is actually really run. But I think you should also say the thing the other way around, that you can't think seriously about the structure unless you have your moral and spiritual precepts very firmly in place, and unless you have a very clear idea of what kind of society you're trying to create. And the whole idea of the stakeholder society, two things really. First of all, if everybody who had a stake also was a great moralist, also had a great sense of that they really are trying to create a better society, and they really are trying to keep the biosphere in good heart. If that was what really went on in people's hearts, then maybe the stakeholder approach would work. Without that, it clearly won't and can't. The other thing is, though, that the whole idea of the stakeholder economy, the stakeholder society, seems to me to be very similar generically as the idea of natural capital or the idea of ecosystem services. In other words, it seems generically related to the idea that you can run the world, or particularly the natural world, by giving it all a cash value and then plugging it into the neoliberal economy and saying what bits are profitable and what aren't. And I think that absolutely is crass in the extreme, can't possibly work. So where I'm inclined to think with the stakeholder economy, in theory, it could work if everybody that was in fact a moralist and was spiritually driven, but in practice won't. But also the sort of groundswell of the idea that you can do things in sort of formulaic terms, I think is quite wrong. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah. Ian, did you have any comments on stakeholder capitalism? Oh, you're muted at the moment.
That's because I was typing. Sorry about that. I think I can understand why it's a nice idea in theory, and I could think of a few probably examples where it appears to work. But the problem is we're in the era of monopoly capital. So every time we think capitalism produces something good, like a good corporation that thinks of the environment and everything else, it seems to get swallowed up at some point. So if you look at something like Ecover, we're all washing liquid and our, all of those vegetable-based cleaning products. That's owned by a massive corporation now. I don't know which one it is, but every time we think we get gains through capitalism and its sort of micro level approach, monopoly capital snaps it up and takes it off and chews it up, and we end up with less choice than we actually feel we have, because it's gone away from us. And I think that's just a problem of the system. It's expansive and competitive, and that's precisely the opposite of how human beings should be acting at this stage of history.
Agreed.
Another example of that, Ian, was that Scott's porridge oats, which is quite a well-known brand. It was bought by Pepsi Cola. It's really horrendous to think that Pepsi Cola owns Scott's porridge oats.
It is quite terrifying when you dig into them.
Yeah. Pepsi Cola is poison.
And Cadbury's were founded on sort of great Christian principles taken over by Kraft, etc., etc.
Quaker principles.
But is this inevitable? I mean, I'm not a defender of capitalism. I'm just saying we should be very careful about our terms. But I mean, is it inevitable that capitalism becomes corporatism? Corporatism, we can all agree, if it's a neoliberal corporate dedicated totally to the creation of wealth, bad. But if it's sort of Ken Clark type company, which is basically capitalist in the way it runs, but has a moral intent and a social conscience, is that necessarily bad?
I think one of the questions is this so-called economies of scale, and the idea that there's economies of scale, and so bigger is better, and so the dynamic is towards further consolidation, and that's really what all of that needs to be broken up and decentralized, as Ian pointed out in that horrendous diagram that he showed us.
But for example, if the Parry Centre or if the College for Real Farming or the SMN became very, very big and influential, we wouldn't think that was bad because they've got this great conscience behind them.
Well, we have to be careful about how we grew and the politics that would inevitably arise.
It's about principles as well. I mean, my previous job was I was boss of a wildlife trust, and we were fighting a motorway in South Wales. And when I went to see the minister, who's in charge of it, I have to be careful what I say, but he did admit that they couldn't mitigate for the damage that was going to be done, and effectively offered me, compensation through various other means. And if I'd accepted it at that point, the road probably would have gone ahead because we were the main opposition funding the public inquiry and everything else. But so you get these little points in the system where your principles are tested and they can paint a picture that suggests, something good. Biodiversity offsetting is seen as a good way to protect biodiversity, but it's not. It's about making money, in this case for NGOs or wildlife charities instead of corporations, but it's still about money and about exchange of financial valuation. It's only because we just said, well, no, that landscape is priceless and we're not going to bend and we're going to fight you all the way, that we're able to maintain that position, and in the end won. But you get these temptations along the way because money is such a hegemonic presence within the capitalist system, and it's such a temptation. Lovely progressive organizations can be set up and then sold off. The Body Shop was another one. Where's that gone? Who owns that now? It's a partial solution, but it depends on, as you say, a higher moral appreciation of principles and that sort of stuff for it to actually make any difference, I think.
And we've got an example right down here. I joined a demonstration against 30 eco cabins around the lake, which effectively would industrialize and commercialize the whole area and ruin it for wildlife and the people who enjoy it already. But of course, it was all couched in the eco language, sustainable development, all of this stuff. But actually, it's just capitalism in disguise. It's a money-making operation for well-off people.
Perhaps I'm confusing capitalism with accountancy. I think good accountancy is always necessary. but it doesn't do anything except it is merely a technical way of handling money. As Keynes said, economists should be rated as they should be treated like dentists, basic technicians, very, very important. Give them respect because they know good things and they're useful, but they're not regarded as gurus, whereas economists, of course, are, and they should be regarded as technicians. Just throw that in.
If the chair can see that Wendy's waving a hand.
And Alan Sanchez is waiting to speak.
Oh.
Yes, I mean, it is 12 o'clock now, so I guess we should really close the session. I'm really sorry, Alan. Maybe in the afternoon session, you'll be able to ask your question. I just wanted to hear if, well, first of all, thank you all for joining us, Ian, Colin, and everyone. Ian, did you have any last food for thought, something to make us think about before next session?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important when you have these sessions to come away with the appropriate level of hope and optimism. I mean, that's embodied in Colin's book, but you should all, I hope, recognize it's embodied in the fact that you're all sitting in this session. You know, nothing changes without good people coming together and working together for that change. And I personally set a kind of, you know, a united front ceiling of about 60% agreement. If you agree with me 60%, I'll work with you to change the world for better. And I think if all of us activists and radicals did that, we'd move a lot further down the line, and we'd learn some very crucial lessons from history. The challenges we have are very real and very existential, and I think, you know, it's going to be sharpened in the years ahead if the far right keep carrying on making the gains that they're making across society, because we are going to have to be a bit more plucky as progressives and take them on as well. So, you know, don't underestimate the challenge, but neither underestimate the fantastic and progressive acts and you know, books like Colin's that make a fundamental difference to people's hope for the future. So I hope that's enough to encourage you all, because I think it's what we're doing is brilliant, and Colin's book is a fantastic contribution. And yeah, let's go change the world, I suppose.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian, for this. Thank you so much, Colin, for this morning's presentation. Thank you, David, for your contribution. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Before we go, I'd just like to give a couple of Power Center announcements, some events that are coming up in the upcoming months before we join again together this afternoon. First of all, I'd just like to invite you all to our next session of our series, Flicker in Reality, Exploring Ideas in Film and Television. This is a free event, and we have the honor of having Kevin Liu, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Essex, who will give his presentation entitled Persona, Masks That Conceal, Masks That Reveal. Kevin, by looking at films such as Wall Street, The Mask with Jim Carrey, and The Farewell, he will analyze these films by highlighting the potentially pathological relationship one can have with one's persona. This event will run on the 2nd of May, so I hope to see you all then. It's a free event again. Then I also like to invite you to our event in May, entitled Ancient Wisdom Transforming Tomorrow. This event will run between the 8th and the 29th of May on weekends, and we'll look at how cultures from different areas of Africa can lead us to roads that can change the world of tomorrow here in the West. For this event, the lineup is composed from different voices from the African continent, including Gavin Anderson, Rutendo Ngara, and special guests Ila Manga and Keith Mprana, all chaired and curated by our own Associate Director, Godlieve Spas. And finally, we'd like to invite you to our main event of the summer entitled What is Consciousness? In this event, which will run between the 5th and 27th of June, on weekends again, we will explore consciousness. not only from a neurophysical perspective, but also from a psychological, philosophical, and human perspective. For this event, we have the honor of having the lineup that includes Richard Baker Roshi, Valerie Hardcastle, Basil Hiley, Bernardo Kastrup, Gary Lackman, Ian McIlgrist, Roderick Main, Pavel Pilkanen, Beverly Zabriskie, all chaired and curated by our own director of the Party Center, Santina Sabadini. Thank you again, everyone. That's it for announcements, and we'll see you again this afternoon here at the Party Center. See you later.
Thank you.